In my previous video, I showed a proof of concept and went through my idea for a simple night service facility for Swyx, which didn't need a database and had the advantage of being able to light a speed dial button either on Swyxit or on Swyx phone with a red light if night service was on and a green light if night service is off. And I said I'd go through the script, so that's the object of this video. There is one proviso on this. If I want to see a red light or a green light for a user, then that user needs to be logged on. So I cannot use this script on a simple call routing user. I'm going to need a user logged on for this call routing. In my case, I'm going to use Swyxit on the server and log it on as the user. There is no problem here. The incoming calls are never actually going to ring the device, and it just works. I only need to do this if I need to see a red or a green light, because it's only possible to show status lights against users that are logged on in Swyx. If I'm not interested in seeing a light, but I'm happy to use Swyxit only and get a pop-up when I hover over the button to show me the status of night service, then obviously I can put this against any call routing user. For those that want to jump straight into it, below in the description of this video you will see a link to a zip file that contains the RSC and all the WAV files used in my example. If you want to jump straight into it, you can download it and play with it. If you want an understanding of how the script works, and for those that don't have much experience in scripting, I'm going to go through the call flow now, and I'll also go into each block afterwards to show you the logic of the box and how it works. And I'll explain the code very simply to you. So here we are. The call comes into our ECR rule, and the first thing I'm going to do is check to see if it's an internal call or an external call. In this script, internal callers can switch the night service on or off. Obviously, if you want to put some protection in here and only allow certain users to switch night service on and off, that's a fairly simple thing to accomplish. For external callers, we jump down to this block here and we check to see if the night service is on. The night service here is actually just the call forwarding unconditional flag inside this user. So we check to see if that flag is switched on. If the flag is switched on, then we divert the call, we transfer the call, we forward the call, whatever you want to call it. We send the call to that number that's been stored in the unconditional call forwarding location. If the call forwarding unconditional flag is not switched on, we simply jump to the rule skip block, which will exit this script, and the call routing manager will then execute the next live script in its list. So that will be your visual groups, your IVR, or whatever normal action is taken during daytime for this number. So now let's look at back to the beginning and look at internal calls. The first block just sets a variable. So I only have one variable, that's new number, and I'm using one of the server function calls, pbxuser, and this particular function, pbxuser.unconditional redirect number, returns the call forward all number that's stored against this user. And that's the only variable. Then I need to check whether that call forwarding number actually exists. The last thing I want to do is switch on call forwarding and there being no number to call forward or redirect the night service calls to. So I check to see if that's empty. If it is empty, I'm going to force the user to input a number. We'll come back to this block in a little bit. So assuming there is a number stored in the system and I've dialed in, we then toggle the night service on or off. If we toggle the night service off, we follow this call flow, and if we switch it on, we follow this call flow. The call flow is fairly similar to both. We have a function here that turns night service on, And we have a similar function here that turns the night service off. We then confirm to the caller with an announcement to say that night service is now switched on or night service is now switched off. And then they get an announcement that says they can at this point just hang up or continue to hold for more options. If they do continue to hold, it's a simple choice. They can manually again switch night service on or off, and it just takes you back through this loop. Or if they do nothing, the system will play a message to them that says the current night service number is. We then read the number to the user, and they're given the option either to return to a previous menu or change the number. If they choose to change the number, they're asked to input a new number and use the hash key to enter. But if they don't use the hash key, it doesn't matter, it'll time out anyway. We use a piece of code to set the call forwarding number. And that's it, a fairly simple script. I'll now go through a couple of the blocks that contain code just to explain what's happening. To toggle night service on or off, we have a bit of Visual Basic, not much here, and I'll come back to that in a second, but remember I've now switched on two possible outputs from this code, and the output is to toggle to off or toggle to on, and I've labeled that so it's easier to read. The code itself, well, the first line, we just write something in the trace files, just in case anything goes wrong and I need to debug it. I've set the default output to use exit 1, and then I ask the system if the unconditional redirect is switched on, I will use exit 0. So in other words, if call forwarding is off, I'll use exit 1, and if call forwarding is on, I'll use exit 0. If I use exit 0, we'll toggle it off. If I use exit 1, we'll toggle to on. Fairly easy to understand. So let's look at the code for setting night service on. The output of this, there is only one output. It's just a simple piece of Visual Basic, and of course writing VB inside this interface isn't very friendly, so we'll switch to Notepad++, where we'll see the code for switching night service on. So I start off with a line that writes to the Swyx trace logs what we're actually doing. The default output for this, and the only output for this block, is exit 0. The PBX unconditional redirect number I make equal to the variable new number, and you'll see why I'm using that later on, because if I change the number I'm going to use the same blocks to come back to. I then use this function to switch the night service on, and night service is just using the unconditional redirect, the call forward all calls. So we switch that on. Then using this function, IPBX user free status text, I write night service is on, and this will be redirected to, and then I use the ampersand to connect the PBX user unconditional redirect number, the call forwarding number. So the Swyxit pop-up card against this call routing user will now show a pop-up text that tells you whether night service is on or off. In this case, night service is on, and the number that's been redirected to. And then finally, the red light, which is just a do not disturb button. So I switch do not disturb on. And that's what happens to switch night service on. I then play an announcement, a simple WAV file, and the WAV file says night service is now switched on. Night service off, well, you won't be surprised, it is more or less the same code, but this time I am setting the unconditional redirect to false. I change the status text to say that night service is off, and I switch off the do not disturb. So the user will go back to the standard logged on status, which is green. Having switched night service on or off, I want to give them an option to either hang up or just continue to hold. So I've used an IVR here without any links other than the timeout. I could have used play announcement, but I quite like that. Then we give them an option to switch night service on or off manually. And again, these just link back to the two flows there. If they do nothing at this point, the system plays the announcement using the say number. We read the number that's stored, and then they're given an option to change the number. If they change the number, we use the input string, and then we have a little bit of code here. And if I go, you can see we start off again writing something to the trace log. In case something goes wrong, we can read it. I can now update the redirect number for this user. So PBX user unconditional redirect number, that function allows you to read or set the call forward number for this user. So whereas before I've been using it to read the number, now I'm setting the number. And then I just quickly see if night service is already switched on. If it is switched on, I'll update the display and input the new number that we've just. And just to explain what happens on external calls, we need to check whether the night service or that call forwarding all is switched on. So this function here, we just call the PBX user unconditional redirect, and if it's true, it's switched on, and if it's false, we go to rule skipped. If it's switched on, we use the connect to block, and we connect to whatever number is stored in the redirect. Now, if you want to send this call to an external number, obviously you need to put the trunk access code in. So in the UK that would be 9 followed by the external number, or you could put an internal number in there and send the call off to another script, and that script could be a voicemail for night service, it could be an IVR for night service or whatever. But of course I need to pass over control of that call now, so don't forget that this box down the bottom, proceed with destinations call routing, must be ticked, and that's why you've only got these outputs. And that's it. And that's just about it. Hope it makes sense, and I hope it's of some use.